Welcome to the latest installment of the IEA's YouTube free speech series of discussions. My name is Mark Glendenning and I'm heading up the Institute's Cultural Affairs unit. And today I'll be talking to Professor Dennis Hayes about his contribution to our new collection of essays, Having Your Say, Threats to Free Speech in the 21st Century, which you can see over my left shoulder. This is hot off the press. You can download it from our website. Just go to the publications section on the header, or if, like me, you prefer to have a good old-fashioned book in your hand, you can buy it on Amazon for £17.50, and there's a cheaper Kindle version. Dennis's chapter is entitled Free Speech, the Freedom That Trade Unions Forgot. Dennis is Emeritus Professor of Education at Derby University. He's an active trade unionist. He was the first joint president of the university and college union. He is the director of academics for academic freedom, and he's very involved in the Free Speech Union. So he's the ideal person, obviously, to be writing about free speech. In your contribution, Dennis, you argue that trade unions have abandoned the cause of free speech, which was once integral to their work and their ethos, because they have taken a therapeutic turn. What do you mean by that?
Let me illustrate it by reading an email that I received yesterday from the University and College Union. It was headed LGBT plus language in use webinar. And the blurb reads, how can we be sure that we are using the best inclusive language? This webinar will provide a safe space to discuss this question in an honest and supportive way. Being more interactive than some of our webinars, we will expect participants to join in small group discussions in order to build confidence. So that's the idea. So you're controlling people's speech, what they say, in a safe space, a therapeutic safe space, where no difficult ideas will be discussed. And the reason is to build confidence. And I think when I talk about the therapeutic turn, I mean a general shift to emphasize your feelings over your intellect. And just to say something slightly academic about this, that Philip Reif wrote a book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic in 1966. And he says this about the change in culture. He says that a sense of well-being has become the end rather than a byproduct of striving after some superior communal end, announces a fundamental change of focus in the entire cast of our culture. And a fundamental break, he says, in Western culture. And I think we're seeing playing out what he, in a very prescient way, saw in 1966. Because with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, to look at the background of this, there was a vacuum in politics. So until that time, people in the West could define themselves as not being communist. And there was a search, if you remember, people talked about the end of history. There was a search for other enemies rather than the Soviet Union, whether it was drugs. And into that vacuum came a sort of therapeutic culture where everybody was concerned about people's emotions. And politically, it became very useful, but I don't think it was done in a conspiratorial way. It just arose spontaneously. You start to see people as victims. You can't offer them a vision for the future. An alternative vision that seems to have disappeared. So all you can do is treat them as if they need help. So in the book, The Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic Education, we explain in chapter 7 how this actually happened. So you start to have a diminished view of human beings as not being capable of taking control of their own lives. And this diminished sense of human beings has become universal now. It inhabits every aspect of professional lives. And in the chapter, I describe it as a new social arrangement. So whether you're in unions or you're in the workplace, there's this new arrangement, which is therapy to victims, T2V. You're actually offering therapy to victims in each circumstance. And I think that really helped the trade unions, because after the collapse of the labour movement, after the miners' strike, there wasn't any sort of clear role for them. They'd always been sort of protecting a certain amount of the workforce, usually white workforce, as collaborative in the workplace. They were fellow workers, everybody had an interest in work. And if you read James Hartfield's great book, The Equal Opportunities Revolution, he makes the point that equality concerns became the new ideology in the workplace. So you were really concerned about women's rights, about racism, about gay rights. All these issues became taken up by management. But the side of it that I want to focus on is not, you could say, well, that's positive, but what came about was everybody was seen as a victim. So you were somebody who lacked any sort of agency and you needed help. And the classic example of this in the workplace was concerns with bullying. And I wrote a book in the 1990s called Attitudes to Work. And we never considered bullying. It wasn't an issue at that time. We never thought about bullying. But since that time, it's become a major issue because the workplace has become very individualized. So the unions have transformed themselves. Instead of trying to collectively fight for better conditions, they now have bought into the equalities agenda. So they will often trade off, and you'll see it in statements by many of the unions. They couldn't get a pay increase, but management agreed to work on an equality agenda with them. So they've actually given up their traditional role, and they're now going into what is largely virtue signaling in the workplace. So you get a badge from Stonewall, you get a badge from Athena Swan in universities to share, and that's all it becomes. But the status quo within workplaces remains the same, but everybody thinks that there's something progressive happening. But what actually does happen, and you see it, because as you said, I'm still an active trade unionist, and the change that I've seen is that people come to you as a trade union a representative really for therapy. So they'll come to you and talk about their problems. They don't necessarily want you to do anything about them. So there's no sense of campaigning. They just feel so much better than they did before because they have somebody to talk to. So that's a therapeutic situation. And you can just see it in every aspect of union life now, that is how you relate to people. You're a victim and we're here to help you. We're the therapists. And one of the examples that we put in The Dangerous Rise is when I worked at previous university, the security guards came to see me about their line manager. And I always remember this, they said, he keeps changing our work schedules and we can't sort out our time with our family because it's too difficult. So I said, oh, well, that's okay, let's go and see him. And they said, no, we don't want to go and see him, but we want to know why he doesn't like us. So there's that feeling, why doesn't he like us? And I can multiply these examples time and time again. So you've got to realize that that's largely what unions do. I mean, the rhetoric about them being, campaigning for paying conditions is still there, but in reality, they see all their members as victims of bullying, and that's why they stress issues like mental health, well-being, as the Trade Union Congress does. So we've entered a sort of therapeutic culture, and it's a very bad one because, like those security guards, if all you want is understanding why people don't like you, you're not going to be a powerful force in the workplace. So it doesn't help workers and it doesn't help management in the end, because you don't want to have a workforce that's entirely full of victims who just want to go into mindfulness classes or seminars. They're everywhere, in every workplace. They've got mindfulness classes, and when you get fired now, they you get offered a well-being course or a mindfulness class to help you cope.
It seems to me that what you're describing is a sort of new form of anti-humanism, a kind of zeitgeist which says that and assumes that people, trade unionists in this case, don't really have human agency, and that the fundamental political differences people might have, the traditional fault lines that separated management from unions, can be overcome with this ideology that brings people together on the basis of this shared sort of therapeutic assumption. And on the one hand, it's sort of sugar-coated with mindfulness and rhetoric about mental health, but the underlying reality is that it is a movement or a move away from democratic conflict and the honest expression of political and workplace differences. Or am I overstating it?
No, that's right. I mean, it's important to see that when you present yourself as a victim, it leaves you lacking in agency, but it also makes you invulnerable. Because if you're a victim, you can't be challenged. Nobody's going to criticize you. So that's where it connects with the free speech issue. Because if once you're presented as a victim, nobody's going to say, well, you're just being silly, this doesn't make sense, or because you can't be touched. It's something that's been known since Princess Diana. Once you explore your feelings, and you say, I've been hurt, I've been offended, there's then nothing you can do. Nobody's going to challenge them because you seem like you're cruel and uncaring. So I do think that therapy culture does, make it impossible to challenge people in the way we would have done once before. And it's funny that it lives alongside the old-fashioned politics, the sort of more democratic politics. So you take the unions, particularly UCU, they will occasionally do things like try and get somebody sacked they don't agree with. So Gunnar Beck, who was at SOAS, who stood for the Alternative for Germany party, they actually called him to be sacked and then threw him out of the union a year later. So that's the sort of old no platforming policies that go on. But that's also always re-expressed in terms of victimhood. So we don't want you to come, not because we disagree with you and you're an evil populist. They may say that, but it's because we'll be offended, we'll be hurt. And this has come out particularly recently with debates about what's now called gender critical feminists. People like Kathleen Stock, and she points out in her statement to the Human Rights Commission that UCU turned down a motion in 2019 to allow academic freedom in terms of a debate about gender issues. So that and what the unions now say, or particularly UCU, which of course represents the universities where you would expect them to be encouraging freedom of debate, they actually think free speech is a right-wing plot. It's something that is being weaponized, and that we shouldn't have it. So nearly half of the leadership signed a statement saying that the debate was over as far as transgender rights are concerned. We're not going to have any debate about it. And they have turned on the government's proposal to have free speech as something that every university must evidence, through the Office for Students, which you can question. I have lots of caveats about that, but they are categorically against it because they see free speech now as a right-wing phenomenon. And one of the ironies for me is I always fought for free speech through academics for academic freedom. And in a sense, I always thought I was quite safe because I wasn't actually saying anything. I didn't say anything controversial. I just said, defend the right for free speech. Absolutely, no ifs, no buts. And but of course, now even saying you want free speech is something that's going to get you condemned. And that is a shift that is quite new, I think. And so we've now got the situation that you want to protect people to the extent that you won't allow any discussion. I think that's a new moment in not just in trade union relations, but in the whole of UK and I suppose in the whole of Western culture.
It's very authoritarian, and so I think perhaps I'm not overstating it when I say it's sinister, and it is inherently anti-liberal, anti-pluralistic. And I'm just going to read you the quote you use in your chapter in the book. So a group of candidates standing for the National Executive Committee of your union issued a statement saying, in the coming years, we are likely to see more attempts to engineer and amplify controversies that will sow confusion and insecurity on campuses. Talks defended in the name of free speech and academic freedom by neo-fascists and transphobes will suit that agenda very well. As trade unionists, we must stand firm in denouncing such manufactured controversies. I mean, that is a pretty extraordinary, and I would argue inherently fascistic statement in itself. When you start talking about the exchange of ideas, the exchange of competing beliefs as something that is sinister, should be prevented, then haven't you crossed a sort of Rubicon into a different ideological space from that of liberal democracy?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the therapeutic turn is an authoritarian turn. So it's putting you into a therapeutic situation is not kindly to you. It's a controlling thing. The quote I said from the email about going into small groups, it's safe spaces where you're going to be told what to think, what words to use, what to think, and what you can say. And people have made the point, if you ever get to be involved in union congresses or whatever, you learn not to speak. I mean, you don't speak because it is a threatening environment. I mean, the only good thing about the liberal trade union is that most members don't know anything about it. And and I know for that fact, from trying to talk to my own members about what the national executive is saying, they don't know. But nevertheless, that message gets over, not having debate. I mean, people often say that in universities, for instance, there's not much actual censorship, but it only takes one or two cases where people get, and in the new phenomenon is an open letter denouncing them signed by 600 academics. And if you look at our banned list, there's many of these things. I think it's a feature of the COVID pandemic that we get these letters rather than the demonstrations. But once that happens to one person, everybody else knows to keep their head down. So it does create an authoritarian climate of silence. And that is one of the really dangerous things about the trade union movement. I wrote a postscript when we wrote that chapter a year or so ago. I put a postscript in about Samuel Paty, who the French teacher who was beheaded by an Islamist for teaching about free speech. And there was total silence from the UK unions, the teacher unions. Only the National Education Union mentioned that he'd been killed, but never said there was anything to do with free speech. There was total silence. And of course, since then, with the Batley Grammar School teacher, where the group of Islamists drive him into hiding, and now he's not unable to work. He could go back to work, but he's too frightened for his life. So he's now in hiding, probably for the rest of his life, in fear. But no union spoke up. No teacher union spoke up. But interestingly, I think it was the Berry Binman put a motion to the National Conference of Trades Councils saying that the union should defend his right to teach. And of course, that was the Unite Union. They were condemned by the National Education Union for raising the issue. So there is,
so we have beyond belief, actually. So it's chilling, and yeah.
So we have this silence, and that's true about what usually happens when somebody gets attacked. I mean, if the unions don't agree with your political views, then they'll either just ignore you, or they will attack you. And of course, the classic example that everybody knows is Paul Embry, who was thrown out as a Fire Brigade union official because of his position on Brexit. So, if you have a different view, you're no longer to part of the union. Lawrence Fox, of course, Equity attacked him for questioning the idea of white privilege on TV. So somebody needs to get the unions to actually come back to defending free speech, but it is almost unchallengeable. The only reason I'd say that is because people don't believe there's a therapeutic culture. And that is, it's not just something that's just something that I say, but you've got to try and say to people, look around when you get these emails, when you look at any statements. You get, I know, going to universities, I sort of collect things I see on the walls, you know. So and you can. It's always about the fact that you're going to be vulnerable, you know. And I mean, just to give examples, I went into, I think it was in LSE, and there was a course for overcoming perfectionism. You know, you go to LSE.
Overcoming what?
Perfectionism.
What is that?
Well, because you go to the LSE, you might, you know, want to change the world, go back to the country of your origin, and perhaps become prime minister. And of course, that might cause you distress. So, you know, so you need a course to lower your expectations. These things happen all the time. You know?
And that's also very much part of this anti-humanist zeitgeist, isn't it? I mean, if you're sort of, rather than encouraging young people to reach for the stars, I don't want to sound too American here, but you know what I mean, being aspirational, going for it, there's now this sort of terrible mentality of trying to mollycoddle people, tell them they shouldn't go for it. I mean, I'd never heard of this phenomenon before you just said what you've said, but I mean, I just find it extraordinary. But it, retrospectively, it's all of a piece, whereby human beings are being told that they must be vulnerable. It's not just about trying to help people who believe themselves to be vulnerable, but it's actually telling all young people they're inherently kind of sickly. I mean, it's almost like a sort of Jane Austen, you know, novel or something.
Well, that's true. I collected a leaflet from a northern university, and it was for counselling services, but it went like this. It said, if you come to this university and you discover and you're studying medicine, you might find out that lots of people are sick, and this may cause you distress. I said, and if you come and you might you're doing sociology, you might find that a lot of people,
shit, Sherlock,
and that might cause you distress. So if you're in that situation, where it's whether you're in a union or a university, you know, you're expected to be vulnerable and share your feelings. And when you don't do that, you seem to be inhuman almost. And I think one of the good things that's happened recently, and I think before we started talking, you mentioned something you might ask me, which was about whether things are going to get better. And about 4 years ago, I went to talk about free speech at Warwick University, and somebody came up to me after, as a young student, and said, I'm really interested in starting a free speech society, and I don't know how to do it, and I'm wary of the student union. So we had a conversation, but since then, lots of young people have set up free speech organizations. We've got a list of them as our friends on the AFAF website. And so I think, and I'm not just doing a sort of, our future is with young people, because a few years ago I wouldn't have said that, but they are rebelling against the infantilization of people being told what to do. And I think that's true in the unions, because I think it's partly because there are a lot of younger feminists who don't like being told they can't debate issues. So there's a healthier new generation of people who are sort of rebelling against this infantilization that you get through this culture. So I think that's a very positive aspect, and we should try and build on it in every way we can. I mean, I know the Free Speech Union have set up Free Speech Champions, which is a group of young people trying to defend free speech. And I think that is just, there's many of these, and I think that is a change that's really welcome, because I think you can say the old organizations, trade unions, and will disappear in many ways. They'll still exist, but they're not doing what they used to do. You know, and people were very cynical about the Free Speech Union when Toby Young first suggested it should come into being. But you know, it's got over 8,000 members now, and it has having some real impact across all sectors of life in Britain. Whereas we concentrate on academics, but you know, that we need the Free Speech Union to deal with comedians who can't tell jokes, and you know, office workers who can't send tweets, all those sort of things that are happening. So, but I think we have got some sort of fight back in defense of free speech. And I think the book from the IEA is another one, you know, to show that there are people who will stand up for free speech.
And what I think is great about the book is that it is bringing together people who have very different political, ideological backgrounds. So what we're seeing, following on from what you've just said, is a realignment in politics, whereby people who may disagree profoundly, say with the position of the Institute of Economic Affairs on economic questions, we are now sort of coming together as a sort of popular front to fight for political, if not economic, liberalism. So, I mean, I'm assuming you're a man of the left, broadly speaking, in terms of your personal history. I don't know if that's the case, but certainly Claire Fox, who I was at university with, at Warwick University many, many decades ago, she has a chapter in the book. She has very different politics to myself. But what I think is exciting is that people are now realigning politically and are setting up sort of parallel structures within civil society to express the value of free speech and democracy and to try and defend it.
I think Claire says in her piece that the old distinctions between left and right don't really exist anymore. And I think what is happening at the IEA and what's happening in other places is something quite exciting. It's more experimental. So instead of just having those dividing lines, people are trying to work together, although they may profoundly disagree, but of course we can argue about everything else as long as we have the free speech. So the important thing though is if we don't have free speech and we can't argue, then it's the foundational value.
Yeah. Once with that, you haven't got democracy. I mean,
you won't have anything. You won't even know whether your own views are true unless you can test them in the court of public opinion. And so having private views is useless. You have to speak up. And I think the more we encourage people to speak up, I think the more chance we have of that simply happening. Because in the end, it's not really difficult. People should just not be afraid and should speak up. I think the gender critical feminists are showing a way forward for us for this. They're prepared to get a lot of flack, to have their jobs threatened, their research threatened, to make sure that they can say that there are men and there are women, and defend the rights, hard-won rights. I sometimes talk to some of the HR people at work, and they always say they're not really into the Twitter world, and I keep saying that there is a lot of suppression of free speech. If you just go onto Twitter and say there are men and there are women and see what happens, you can't do that. And so I think, well, you can, but you're going to have a Twitter storm against you. But I think the more we can emphasize the need to speak up, the better. I don't think it's complicated. But my caveat is always, if you feel it's going to hurt somebody, you're not going to speak up. And it's not to get back to the old way of looking at things. I once wrote an article many years ago called Being Bullied, Just Grow Up, right? Because it's a playground activity. But now everybody talks about being bullied. I get messages about bullying emails. If somebody says, do your job. So you get this, I get a complaint from a union member that I'm being bullied. It's become a sort of, almost any aspect of normal life is reinterpreted as threatening.
Yeah. So I remember, sorry.
No, I always say to people, I said, just be alert to constant calls to be invited to well-being sessions and mindfulness classes and everything else that's put in front of you, rather than, because that just keeps you as you are and looking inward. So as long as you're nasal gazing, you have no threat to anybody. And if you're sitting in your safe space and not communicating with anybody, well, you may as well not exist. So that's where you're saying it's totally dehumanizing, because you're just looking inward and you're not engaging with any other human being. I mean, it's going to be a big challenge for us, I think, as we come out of COVID, to start engaging with human beings again. But at least, the first basis we have is this sort of defense of free speech. And, I always say free speech, no ifs, no buts. And one of the young free speech champions said, what arguments can you use? And I kept thinking, one I always use is wait for the but. So somebody will say, I believe in free speech, but. And I'll say the argument is when you use the but, it negates the first part of the statement. You don't believe in free speech.
Yeah.
But everybody, who rhetorically will support free speech will have the but. So we have to challenge them and say, look, you don't really support free speech. But then you have to make the argument that it is important to you and your own development and your own nature as a human being. You can't develop unless you express your ideas and have them challenged in debate. So you're less than human if you don't do that.
Which I think is a fantastic argument and point to end on. This really is a battle for humanism. And the other side on this issue don't really have the courage to own their own position in the way that authoritarians of the past used to be quite explicit about their desire to censor and to restrict what we were allowed to say and view and be exposed to. Whereas now you have this sort of nightmarish sort of double speak, whereby they simultaneously claim they believe in free speech, but then, as you say, the but comes and they justify this sort of censorship, not with good old-fashioned authoritarian, honest rhetoric and argument, but through duplicitous, dishonest lines of argument about people's well-being and sensitivity.
Yeah, the basic point is if you disagree with them, then it's not a political disagreement. It's the fact that you're not well. You need help and therapy until you get to the right view. So it seems kind, but as you quite rightly say, no, you need help. We'll support you. And when you hear those words, you just know that you're not going to be supported. You're going to be told what to think and what.
Well, you're going to be sent on a sort of re-education class. I mean, it is a sort of soft form of totalitarianism. Dennis, thank you very much for giving us your time. I found what you have had to say both fascinating but also inspiring. You communicated the case for free speech in a way I hadn't really heard before, and I think is very valuable for the pro-free speech movement. Before I say goodbye, I'm just going to remind you of this book, Having Your Say, Threats to Free Speech in the 21st Century, available on Amazon, available on the IEA website, free to download. Thank you for watching.